tomorrow for the third launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Columbia will remain in orbit for 7 days and will perform a whole range of experiments, including one devised by Minnesota schoolboy Todd Nelson to try to discover whether insects can learn to fly in space.
Todd's proposal was simply this: take 24 adult caterpillar moths like these, 24 unhatched moths, 12 bees and 12 unhatched flies, put them in a box just like this one and see how they perform in weightless conditions. Why these insects? Because they represent a wide spectrum of insect life. And these are the actual bees that are going to go up with the Space Shuttle, 12 bees. And here are about 100 pupae for the common housefly. They'll select 12 of these and send them up, and during the flight they'll hatch and become flies. We took Todd for his first close-up look at the launch pad. The shuttle itself still hidden by the gantry, the 2 solid rocket boosters, and between them the giant fuel tank, orange this time because they left it unpainted, thereby saving £8,000 in money and £600 in weight. And Todd Nelson took it all very much in his stride. Well, you're looking at the launch site close up for the first time. What do you think of it?
Probably the magnitude of the project, the complexity.
Impressive?
Most impressive.
John Suchet, ITN, with the Space Shuttle.
For the third launching of America's Space Shuttle Columbia are going ahead as planned at Cape Canaveral. The crew have been rehearsing emergency landing procedures ready for takeoff at 3 o'clock our time tomorrow afternoon. The countdown for Columbia has so far gone without a hitch. Its 2 previous launches were plagued by long delays because of various equipment breakdowns. After final briefings for their 7-day flight, astronauts Jack Lousmer and Gordon Fullerton are said to be fit and ready. In fact, Columbia's emergency rescue crews appear to be the only ones facing problems. They also have to cope with the local swamp inhabitants. And of course, Columbia's launch tomorrow afternoon will be covered in our news programmes. That's all from us now for this weekend. Good night.
There's been a slight hitch in the final countdown for America's Space Shuttle, which is being launched from Cape Canaveral this afternoon. A problem developed with the equipment pumping liquid oxygen and hydrogen into the Columbia's huge external fuel tanks. And though it was quickly put right, the countdown had to be delayed by an hour to 4 o'clock our time. It's the third of 4 flights designed to test the shuttle and its equipment and to carry out a series of experiments in space. The plan is for Columbia and its 2-man crew to spend a week in orbit, and that's the longest flight so far. This report from our science correspondent, David Wilson.
Shuttle control, the unofficial...
4 months ago, the Columbia shuttlecraft landed after its second flight had been cut short because of failure of one of its fuel cells and trouble with maneuvering engines. So the world's first reusable spacecraft was hurried back to Cape Kennedy for repairs and refurbishment to meet the tight schedule to start its 3rd test flight today. This time there will be a number of interesting space experiments packed into the enormous payload bay of the shuttle. They include one British experiment from the University of Kent, which will examine micrometeorites and space dust. Another experiment will examine the growth of plants in space to see whether they form woody substances in the same way as they do on Earth. The shuttle will also carry a trial version of what they call the Getaway Special. Anyone will be able to book small, cheap experimental packages on it for future flights. On this flight, the shuttle crew will do much work with the Canadian-built manipulator arm. Some marvellous pictures of this arm came from the last flight. Incidentally, that's the world up above. This time, though, it will have to perform more complicated handling operations. The commander on this 3rd mission is Jack Lousmer, who spent 59 days in space aboard Skylab. With his pilot Gordon Fullerton, who's never been into space but has flown shuttle practice landings, he's been training hard for this mission. The main fuel tank of the space shuttle has also arrived at Kennedy. This is the one part of the ensemble which doesn't get saved. This time they haven't painted it white. and that alone saves 600 pounds of weight in orbit. Last month, all the parts were mated together, and they set off on the slow trip to the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. This time, the flight is planned to last 7 days, so it'll be much the most severe test of the shuttle so far. But now all is ready on the launch pad to see whether Shuttle will be a commercial launch craft into space. So the stage is set for liftoff in just over 3 hours' time, at about 4 o'clock this afternoon our time. Watching the countdown with me is our space expert, Geoffrey Pardo. Now, Geoffrey, broadly speaking, what's the object of today's flight?
Well, this third of the fourth flights really is to continue proving this very important space transportation system, which is a commercial type of operation. So the 7 days in orbit that it will have this time is to check out the fact that the systems can last that long. It will carry out a variety of tests on the shuttle itself, but of course most important is to prove that it can carry a payload. So in this particular model, the payload bay, of course, is empty here, but 9 of the 15 experiments will be located in the rear end of that payload bay there. And one of the experiments, as you mentioned, will be this remote manipulating system built by SPA in Canada to pull out from the payload bay small environmental monitoring experiments in this case and put them back. Of course, in operational life it will take out complete satellites or even rocket stages. So, in summary, to prove the whole vehicle, but to carry out a very interesting array of scientific and biological and medical tests at the same time.
Yes, did the manipulator arm work properly last time?
Yes, it did. There was a very small problem in one of the backup modes, but no basic problem, and it seems to be an exceptionally, indeed, the largest robot in the world so far in that sense.
Well, now, this time they're talking about doing a lot of heating experiments and flying it this way and that way. Now, what does that mean?
One of the reasons for having it up 7 days is to see how it soaks in the temperature of the sun. And in fact, they're going to turn this thing towards the sun with the payload bay open, away from the sun with the payload bay looking towards Earth, the nose to the sun, etc. It's rather interesting that when they turn it towards the sun and they let it soak for a day and a half and it gets very hot, in fact, the side nearest the sun will expand and the whole thing will bend slightly, even 2 degrees, a little like a little banana, you know, very slightly. So
and then they turn it round and straighten it up more or less.
That's right. It will straighten up, of course, but that's the idea of exposing it in one direction for a long time to the sun to make sure it flexes without any problems.
Now, they did have the problem last time with the fuel cell and the reaction motors. Can you show us where that is on here?
Yes, in fact, it's beneath the payload bay. This is a 60-foot long, 15-foot diameter bay, and right down at the bottom there, in the back, were the 3 fuel cells, one of which gave a problem. No problem now, it's all checked, should be a good flight.
Well, we'll have a look this afternoon, Geoffrey. Thanks very much indeed.
The crew who will be flying it are Colonel Jack Loosmer and Colonel Gordon Fullerton, both in their mid-40s. There'll be some passengers too, bees, flies and moths. Scientists want to know if they can fly in zero gravity. This from an American reporter watching the preparations.
On the runway at the Kennedy Space Center, astronauts Jack Lousma and Gordon Fullerton practiced landings today in training aircraft. They would bring the shuttle down here if there were a problem right after launch. Along the nearby highways, thousands of people prepared to spend tonight, so they will have a good view tomorrow. This has been one of Florida's busiest tourist seasons, and a lot of visitors are here for the show.
I hear there's a lot of noise to it.
That's what we're here for, the big bird.
The orbiter Columbia is scheduled to stay in space for 7 days this trip. The astronauts will maneuver it into 4 different positions with respect to the sun. Engineers want to learn whether the huge temperature difference between the sunny and the shady sides of the shuttle will affect any of the gear on board. They need to know, for example, whether the cargo bay doors will always open and close smoothly. Inside the cargo bay, the Columbia will carry a pallet with the equipment for 8 scientific experiments. One of these will measure the radiation from solar flares, the huge bursts of energy that erupt occasionally on the sun's surface. Other gear will measure the environment around the spacecraft. Dust, charged particles, radio waves. Most of this in preparation for experiments on future flights. 2 tests will require the astronauts to pick up an instrument with the shuttle's robot arm. There will be some smaller experiments on board, including one to study plant growth in space.
I'll be back at 4:15 this afternoon with an extended ITN news flash of the shuttle launch. The Space Shuttle Columbia has successfully blasted off on its third test flight from Cape Canaveral in Florida. It lifted off on the button 15 minutes ago after an hour's delay because of a minor fault outside the craft during fueling. And it's now well on the way to its orbit 150 miles above the Earth, with astronauts Jack Lousmer and Gordon Fullerton up front. Behind them a 9-ton payload of experiments, most of them on a British Aerospace pallet in the payload bay, and a particularly interesting one with them in the cabin, to discover how bees and moths fly in zero gravity. The purpose of the flight, as with all test flights, to stretch the performance a bit more and particularly measure the effects of the searing solar heat on all parts of the structure, not just on the underside of the craft. It normally flies with its doors facing the Earth. This time they'll be rolling Columbia like a sausage on a spit. They plan to stay up for more than 7 days, 116 orbits. That's more than twice as long as before. Here's how the launch went.
T-minus 15. 14, 13, 12, 10. We are go for main engine ignition. 8, 7, 6. We have main engine ignition.
Houston, now controlling. Mission control confirms roll maneuver started. 20 seconds. Thrust looks good. Roger, sounds good. 26 seconds. Roll maneuver completed. 30 seconds. 1 nautical mile in altitude. Throttling engines down now up to 68% as programmed. 38 seconds. Flopboard status looks good. Mission control. 42 seconds. Columbia now 3 nautical miles in altitude. 46 seconds. Coming up now to create a maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. 55 seconds. Pass through max Q. Still looking good. Throttling engines back to 100%. Giving a go at throttle up.
Columbia, Houston, here. Go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up. We're going here too.
Mark 1 minute 10 seconds. Columbia now 7 nautical miles in altitude, 4 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 2,700 feet per second.
Roger, 460.
Mark 1 minute 25 seconds. Columbia now 11 nautical miles in altitude, 8 nautical miles downrange.
Roger, we're looking.
That was Jack Lousmer reporting a Freon loop light. 1 minute 40 seconds. Coming up on negative seats where altitude is too high for ejection seat use.
Columbia, Houston, negative seats. Negative seats.
Mark 1 minute 55 seconds. Columbia now 21 nautical miles in altitude, 19 nautical miles downrange.
CC 50, Houston.
2 minutes 2 seconds. Standing by for solid rocket booster separation confirmation.
Okay, there's 103.
2 minutes 15 seconds. Confirm solid rocket booster separation.
Roger, Columbia, we confirm guidance.
None of the problems there that dogged the final moments of countdown for the first 2 test flights. Columbia, in fact, beginning to behave like what it's meant to do, a vehicle for routine space flight. As for today's crew, seen earlier at the traditional breakfast time photo call, they're Jack Lousmer with the hair and Gordon Fullerton without. The senior man is Lousmer, a 46-year-old Marine Corps colonel. He was in the backup crews for 3 Apollo missions and has been in space before as pilot in Skylab 3 in 1973, which stayed up for 59 days. Fullerton is a 45-year-old Air Force pilot, also a colonel. He used to test fly bombers. He's been a NASA astronaut for 13 years. That's how long he's waited for that moment. A big difference, another big difference for this flight is its landing site. White Sands in New Mexico, 1,000 miles from Edwards in California. That's where they're coming down next Monday. Only 3 minutes extra flying time, though. And the reason Edwards can't be used is this. The salt flats there are under the few inches of water, which each year washed them into that fantastically flat expanse of runway, but not for this test flight. So, they're safely in orbit, we're here now. Columbia is safely in orbit on its 3rd test flight. So routine spaceflight takes another step forward, and we leave you with those spectacular pictures of today's launch.
13, 12, 10. We are go for main engine ignition. 8, 7, 6. We have main engine ignition.
Blasting back into space, Columbia takes off, hoping it's third time lucky. Hello again. The American Space Shuttle Columbia is now circling the Earth at the start of what should be a 7-day mission that'll clock up 3 million miles. The shuttle took off from its launch pad in Florida exactly an hour ago. It was 60 minutes late leaving because of a small technical hitch. And only a few minutes after takeoff, there was another problem with one of the units that makes electricity on board Columbia. Well, now America's space team is hoping that it can be put right and that luck will travel with astronauts Jack Lousmer on the left and Gordon Fullerton for the rest of the mission. Countdown had been going perfectly at Cape Canaveral until a fault cropped up in the equipment that pumped liquid oxygen and hydrogen into the huge fuel tank. It was soon put right, but the countdown was delayed an hour. Yesterday, the astronauts flew the simulator plane, practicing the way they'll be landing the shuttle. And Lousmer told reporters how they'll be treating the real thing.
We're going to pretend like we're just in a simulator when we're out there. If you look at the big bird too close, you know, it gets kind of awesome. But if you get in the cockpit, it's just like home.
And the craft, which is to be home for the two men for the next 7 days, took off perfectly from Cape Canaveral an hour ago.
Main engine ignition. 8, 7, 6. We have main engine ignition.
The fault in one of the power units developed just a few minutes after the takeoff as Columbia soared towards orbit.
Mark 1 minute 10 seconds. Columbia now 7 nautical miles of altitude, 4 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 2,700 feet per second.
So Columbia is safely on her way at the start of the shuttle's third mission. And Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been following the launch from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. And I hope that he's on the line now. Hello, Reg. Can you hear me?
Hello, John.
Hello. Reg, tell me a little bit more about this hitch up in space.
Well, it's one of the 3 all-important power units which gave trouble on the previous mission. They're used both for the launch and for the re-entry, but not during flight. One of them has had to be shut down because it's overheated. We don't know yet whether they can start it up again. And if they can't, they may have to consider shortening the mission, but it's not certain.
So it's quite an important fault then. Hello, Reg, can you hear me?
Sorry, John.
It's an important fault, is it?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said, but the position at the moment is that they're going ahead with the plan. They should be opening those 60-foot-long payload bay doors in a few minutes, and certainly Jack Lousmer was worried about the trouble with the power units because his heartbeat shot up to 132 per minute, whereas Fullerton was only 92.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. Obviously, anxious moments up in space, and Reg will be keeping us up to date during the rest of the week with the Columbia mission.
Main engine ignition.
After an hour's delay, America's space shuttle lifts off for its third flight. But after only 8 minutes, there's another snag.
Vision Show cable.
Israeli troops facing more demonstrations on the West Bank kill a Palestinian youth and wound 3 others. And the actor Harry H. Corbett, Harold of Steptoe and Son, has died. America's space shuttle blasted off from Cape Canaveral this afternoon just 1 hour behind schedule on its third and most ambitious flight. The Columbia craft, with its crew of 2, will be in orbit for 7 days, the longest so far. After the delay in launching, the flight's going smoothly, in spite of a problem with one of the power units on board. Our science correspondent David Wilson's been monitoring this afternoon's pictures from Cape Canaveral.
There was an hour's delay in the countdown early this morning, but this was only because of a failure in the ground equipment pumping in Shuttle's fuel. The captain, Jack Lousmer, and the pilot, Gordon Fullerton, went unperturbed through the pre-launch routine, including the inevitable filmed breakfast. The weather was fine, and the only problem was that the landing site was changed because of downpours of rain in Western America. Otherwise, the countdown was perfect to the second.
Minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 10. We are go for main engine ignition. 8, 7, 6. We have main engine ignition.
This is to be a 7-day mission to prove that Shuttle will really work as a commercial space launching vehicle.
30 seconds, 1 nautical mile in altitude, throttling engines down now to 68% as programmed. 38 seconds, flopboard status looks good, mission control. 55 seconds, pass through max Q, still looking good, throttling engines back to 100%.
A number of fairly simple experiments are being carried, but the main object is to test the craft itself against the strains and heat of a long trip.
Columbia now 7 nautical miles in altitude.
But even as Columbia was dropping its booster rockets, there came the first sign of trouble. One of its 3 auxiliary power units was overheating and had to be switched off. It's the same unit that caused the last flight to be shortened. But so far, they haven't announced any change in their plans.
2 minutes, 15 seconds, confirm solid rocket booster separation.
Space flight on time, almost. A new row as the Argentine flag goes up in the Falklands. Harry H. Corbett, Harold Steptoe, dies aged 57.
Good evening. The American Space Shuttle Columbia is safely in orbit on its third and longest test flight. And it was third time lucky. Liftoff from Cape Canaveral at 4 o'clock this afternoon was just an hour late. The previous 2 launches were delayed for days by technical problems. This time, the mission's due to last 7 days, 115 times around the Earth before landing at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. There's been one problem so far, an abnormal temperature reading, but there's no danger to the 2 astronauts.
Now a familiar sight, the Space Shuttle Columbia on the pad again for its 3rd flight into space. There was an unexpected bonus for the crew this morning, Flight Commander Jack Lousmer and co-pilot Gordon Fullerton. They got an hour's extra sleep. A heater on a piece of ground equipment broke down, which temporarily stopped the fueling and led to an hour's delay in the launch. But the astronauts ate their traditional pre-launch breakfast of steak and eggs and then followed the familiar path into the suiting up room to test the suits they'll only have to wear if there's an emergency. Out to the flight pad, and apart from the cloud which rather spoiled the view, it was a textbook launch.
12, 10, we are go for main engine ignition. 8, 7, 6, we have main engine ignition.
Seconds, 1 nautical mile in altitude, throttling engines down now to 68% as programmed. 38 seconds.
2 minutes into the flight, the shuttle jettisoned its solid rocket boosters, and shortly after that it left the Earth's atmosphere. First comment from Jack Lousmer, boy, what a barn burner. John Suchet, ITN, at the NASA Monitoring Center.
Good evening. Tonight, 5 hours after blast-off, America's Space Shuttle Columbia is orbiting the Earth for the 3rd time. The launch from Cape Canaveral was an hour late, but the takeoff itself was flawless. There was a slight problem with a power unit shortly afterwards, but Mission Control says the flight is going ahead as planned. Our science correspondent David Wilson has been monitoring Columbia's progress.
1-hour delay in the countdown early this morning was caused by a failure in one of the Cape Canaveral ground-based pumps, so there was a hold-up in getting the last of Shuttle's fuel aboard. The captain, Jack Lousmer, and the pilot, Gordon Fullerton, went cheerfully through the pre-launch routine, including the inevitable filming at breakfast time.
So Columbia now 7 nautical miles altitude, 4 nautical miles downrange, velocity now reading 2,700 feet per second. 2 minutes.
The first important stage was to slough off its booster rockets. But just as it achieved this, trouble struck. One of its 3 auxiliary power units started overheating and had to be shut down. These units steer the craft into re-entry, but it can manage on 2, and so for the moment the mission carries on.
And if we get any more on Columbia's progress, we'll bring it to you later in the programme. Mr. Whitelaw talks of new police powers. The Space Shuttle is up there, just one snag. An Argentine flag flies briefly on a British island. Shell puts up petrol 5p a gallon. Who's next? And tests its 2 television cameras. They looked at the missing tiles and in the process sent back some stunning pictures of the Earth.
Houston, we have a spectacular view of the East Coast.
They also reported a stowaway's eye view. A Florida fruit fly somehow smuggled itself on board.
In 10 minutes on BBC One, there's the last programme in the present series with Grandad. First, John Craven's News Round.
Icy waters of Antarctica, a Royal Navy ship heads for an island that's been invaded. Hello again. A bleak and mountainous island in the South Atlantic Ocean is tonight in the middle of a row between Britain and the country of Argentina. The Royal Navy's ice patrol ship HMS Endurance is said to be heading for the island, South Georgia, to check out reports that a team of men from Argentina are still there after landing on the island illegally last weekend. South Georgia belongs to the Falkland Islands, which are controlled by Britain. But as we reported on Monday when the news first broke, Argentina has claimed for a long time that the Falklands and South Georgia really belong to her. The only people living on South Georgia are the scientists of the British Antarctic Survey. Its base camp is there, and at the moment 13 men are at the base. HMS Endurance, the only ship in the Royal Navy that's painted red, patrols the icy waters around the Falklands. Her crew is made up of sailors and Navy scientists, and she also has a number of Marines and 2 helicopters. Reports say she's expected to arrive at South Georgia later today. The island was discovered and claimed for Britain 200 years ago by the famous explorer Captain Cook. Last weekend, a party of about 60 Argentinians landed there and started to collect scrap metal. There's a disused township once used by the crews of whaling ships. Most of the men later left, but reports say about 6 of them have stayed, and they've hoisted the Argentinian flag on South Georgia. Astronauts on board the Space Shuttle have been having a restful day because they were so busy yesterday. They'd had to cope with a few problems which meant that they didn't get much sleep. It took longer than expected to close the doors of the payload bay because part of the equipment had frozen. And as we reported on Newsround yesterday, 25 tiles are missing or damaged on Columbia's nose section, and another 12 are damaged on the rear of the craft. The tiles protect the shuttle during re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. Scientists at Mission Control were able to examine the nose using the TV camera, which has since broken down, and they were satisfied the damage wasn't serious. Meanwhile, Lousmer was busy with a medical experiment to produce a vaccine for people suffering from heart disease. It's much easier to make in the weightlessness of space. Well, Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been following the shuttle's 3rd mission from the Space Centre at Cape Canaveral, and he's on the line now, I hope.
Hello. Yes, John.
Reg, tell me more about all these problems they're having.
With all these problems, John, I'm afraid the astronauts are a bit miserable today. They're both apparently taking pills because of space sickness, and on top of that, their toilet won't work again. It's gone wrong on all 3 flights so far. So Mission Control let them sleep late and then switch tomorrow's light program around with today's heavy one. One result will be that later tonight, though, they should be getting out the containers of moths and bees and trying to persuade them to fly while weightless.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. We hope to have more news from you tomorrow. Bye for now.
Bye.
The Shuttle Columbia has been changed to give the crew more time to rest between experiments. It's the third day of the mission, which has been dogged by a series of minor equipment failures. Some 3 dozen of Columbia's thermal protection tiles have been lost, a problem also encountered on its first 2 flights. Our science correspondent David Wilson has been studying the latest pictures sent back as the shuttle orbits the Earth.
The TV camera on the shuttle's handling arm looked down over the pilot's cabin to provide these shots of the missing heat shield tiles. All the damaged areas seem to be in the white part of the Columbia craft, however, and that's the part that doesn't get too hot during re-entry. Safely inside the craft, Captain Jack Lousmer carried out one of the scientific experiments. He tested out an electrical method of separating living cells and body chemicals. It's hoped that one day better medicines and vaccines will be made in space, where gravity doesn't interfere. His results are frozen, so they can be examined when he gets back to Earth. Mission Control at Houston emphasized that he'd been working with human blood samples by making a joke when pilot Gordon Fullerton came into the picture.
Wally? Is that the vampire that goes with the red blood cells?
Today's Blue Peter begins in just under 10 minutes. Before that, John Craven's News Round.
Spectacular pictures of the Earth from the Space Shuttle Columbia. Hello again. As the Space Shuttle Columbia circles the Earth 150 miles up, the 2 astronauts on board are having their busiest day yet. Besides sending back some of the best pictures ever seen from space, they've carried out crucial tests on the ability of the remote-controlled arm to lift heavy loads. The pictures beamed back to Earth by the shuttle's TV cameras showed breathtaking views of the Earth. Today, tests will provide the scientists at Mission Control with vital information about the efficiency of Columbia's remote control arm. 9 of the scientific experiments are stored in the payload bay, among them one from Britain which measures man-made pollution in space. Meanwhile, Lousmer was keeping an eye on the moths and bees in an experiment devised by an American schoolboy.
Most of them have positioned themselves around the periphery of the box or fastened themselves onto something, and unless we agitate them a little bit and make them get going. Now it seems like the moths are doing a little better than the bees. The bees are just sort of tumbling around without flapping their wings.
Newsround space editor Reg Turnhill has been keeping us up to date with what's happening on board Columbia, and he's on the line now from Cape Canaveral. Hello, Reg. What's the point of this experiment with the bees and the moths?
Well, the idea is that when we start building space colonies, and I guess that would be in the early 2000s, it'll be very important to know whether insects, and especially honeybees, for instance, will be able to live and work up there with us.
And Reg, what is happening at this moment up in space?
It's about the most important point in the whole program at the moment. Gordon Fullerton, and we're seeing it on television, has just demonstrated that the robot arm can lift big spacecraft out of the payload bay and put them safely back in again.
So that's very good news for Mission Control. It works. Reg, thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye. And we'll be talking to Reg again, I hope, on Monday at the end of the shuttle mission.
And crew of the American Space Shuttle say they're no longer troubled by the motion sickness and fatigue they felt earlier. They've told Mission Control they're fully fit for the rest of the programme of experiments. Here's our science correspondent David Wilson.
Astronauts Lousmer and Fullerton are now getting used to the conditions in the Columbia shuttlecraft and recovering from their motion sickness. So they've been able to enjoy the spectacular views of the Earth provided by the television cameras perched on the manipulator arm, but often directed from Mission Control below. Inside the cabin, the commander demonstrated the student experiment which has most captured people's imagination. The experiment that asks how bees and moths will try to fly in conditions of weightlessness.
Most of them have positioned themselves around the periphery of the box or fastened themselves onto something, and unless we agitate them a little bit and make them get going. Now it seems like the moths are doing a little better than the bees. The bees are just sort of tumbling around without flapping their wings.
But whether those tumbling bees are sensible or lazy or just thoroughly bemused...
They to launch satellites and handle freight on future trips. The astronauts have also been finding out how some of their fellow travellers, some moths and bees, are reacting to space travel. Andrew Mandelstam reports.
A series of minor problems continued to plague the mission, so a few experiments had to be curtailed. But the astronauts who'd complained of tiredness and motion sickness still found time to send back some of the clearest television pictures of the Earth ever. Despite the failure of two of the craft TV cameras, there were views of the Columbia's 50-foot mechanical arm and the cargo bay area. One experiment, designed by an 18-year-old student, did go ahead. It involved monitoring the flight of bees and moths in weightless conditions.
But there are some among us who are actually flying faster than we are. And in this box, they're not only flying along with us, but they are flying themselves. So they're actually going a lot faster than we, I think. And most of them have positioned themselves around the periphery of the box or fastened themselves onto something. And unless we agitate them a little bit and make them get going. Now it seems like the moths are doing a little better than the bees. The bees are just sort of tumbling around without flapping their wings.
NASA officials insist they're happy at the way that the Columbia is performing. The shuttle has now been up in space longer than during any of its two previous missions. Andrew Mandelstam for News at 10 in the United States.
Space Shuttle is going ahead on schedule despite some trouble with radio equipment. The two astronauts, Jack Lousmer and Gordon Fullerton, are now past the halfway mark in their 7 days orbital flight. They've apparently overcome the motion sickness which had been troubling them and have been carrying out experiments with Columbia's 50-foot manipulator arm. They'll also be checking on the radio unit, which has given problems. Space agency officials have warned that if the difficulty is serious, the mission...
The radio system have got worse, and mission control say they may have to bring the spacecraft back to Earth earlier than Monday.
Columbia now seems likely to complete its 7-day mission despite continuing problems with its transmitters. Officials at the NASA Space Center in Houston say they've no plans to bring astronauts Jack Lousmer and Gordon Fullerton back before Monday. They've had to deal with several other minor problems, including faulty TV cameras and cargo doors. But NASA are confident there are enough backup systems to ensure their safe return, providing weather conditions at the landing site are good. There's now just one major experiment to be completed, exposing the equipment in the cargo bay to the full heat of the sun for a continuous 26 hours.
They're afraid
Weather conditions at the landing site in New Mexico may deteriorate on Monday. The astronauts were woken by messages from their families and have begun their last major experiment, exposing the equipment in the cargo bay to continuous sun. But it may be cut short if there's an early...
There'd be a sandstorm on the landing strip at White Sands, New Mexico. It's now believed the weather will be all right.
On the American Space Shuttle, now in their final day in orbit, are checking equipment and tidying up Columbia, ready for landing in New Mexico. David Wilson's been watching their week's journey into space.
As the astronauts opened the cargo bay doors for a final day's work, California was passing underneath. They've had success, but only a qualified success. Shuttle works, but there are still many troubles to iron out. Jack Lousmer demonstrated using the water jet to liquefy a solid soap pad. Then he had to work up a lather to get a good hand wash. This is the astronaut's hygiene station. The hanging cupboard in front of him holds his brush, comb, razor, toothbrush, and his own set of towels. But in the weightlessness of orbital flight, managing a towel is something you have to get used to. And machinery, which will work on Earth, doesn't always work in space. At the White Sands base, the forecast for tomorrow's landing is good, though there are high winds at high altitude. Landing should be about 8:30 tomorrow evening.
And that's all from me.
And later today, with only an outside chance that the weather might hold things up. After its 7-day mission, the shuttle is expected to touch down at about 8:30 our time. The landing area at White Sands in New Mexico is little more than a runway in the desert. It was decided to bring Columbia down there after flooding at the original site. And White Sands is an aptly named and isolated spot. Full rehearsals for the safety precautions for the shuttle's arrival have been taking place, although it's acknowledged that in its first 2 missions, it was the landing that seemed to give Columbia least trouble. Much of the descent is controlled by the vehicle's highly sophisticated computers.
Finally, the Space Shuttle Columbia is preparing to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere in about 3.5 hours' time at the end of its 7-day mission. Engineers at Mission Control have warned the astronauts about strong winds at the landing strip, but now touchdown looks set to go ahead as planned. If all goes well, this is the view Columbia's astronauts will have as they glide in to land. The runway is on an Army missile base in the desolate White Sands desert of New Mexico. At first, the Army didn't want spectators at the landing, but President Reagan himself requested that people should be allowed in to watch the event. The preparations have taken several days because equipment had to be moved from the usual site in California, which had to be abandoned because of flooding. Well, Newsround Space Editor Reg Turnell has been following the shuttle mission from Cape Canaveral, and hopefully he's on the line now. Hello, Reg. Is everything going smoothly?
Well, apart from those strong winds, and Jack Lausmer said it was disappointing when told he must change his landing approach, but they have got the cargo door safely shut and they're now struggling into their pressure chutes, ready to fire the re-entry rockets at 7:30.
Is it too early to say whether it's been a successful mission or not?
Well, Mission Control insists it's been a highly successful mission, though the latest disappointment has been the loss of a £1 million experiment studying the sun, just because someone on the ground forgot to throw a switch.
Well, Reg, thanks very much for joining us from Cape Canaveral. And there'll be coverage of the landing on BBC One just before 8:30 tonight. But if you can't see that, we'll bring you all the news on the shuttle tomorrow. And that's all for today. Until tomorrow.
Set to land this evening, with latest reports saying the weather won't hold things up. After its 7-day mission, the shuttle will touch down at this remote desert runway in New Mexico in about 3 hours' time. The two-man crew report no problems. The landing can be seen live on BBC One at about 8:30 in Panorama.
Good evening. Tonight, we were hoping also to go over live to New Mexico to show you the American Space Shuttle landing, but they're still up there in orbit tonight. And we've just heard descent has been delayed by at least 24 hours. Apparently, weather conditions at the landing site are too bad.
The burn scheduled to bring Columbia down, he told Mission Control, "I think we ought to knock this off." They said, "OK, we concur." So the crew of Columbia, Jack Lausmer and Gordon Fullerton, stay up for an 8th day, and indeed have the fuel to stay up for 3 more. If they do come down at the Cape, it'll be on the 3-mile-long super runway, custom built for shuttle, but not meant for use before November at the earliest, when enough is known about landing Columbia to risk putting it down on concrete. Still, tonight, Mission Control are prepared to bring that event forward. Even the 3 perfect blast-offs, 3 perfect landings. You're watching history being made. And the cheers from Mission Control in Houston, 700 miles away. And there it is.
The mission elapsed time of touchdown, unofficially 8 days, 0 hours, 4 minutes, 49 seconds.
And let's not lose sight of the fact that these are test flights for the most sophisticated flying machine ever devised. And yes, things have gone wrong. A power unit gave trouble. Part of the radio system didn't work. 37 of the 30,000 heat-proof tiles fell off. And even the lavatories got blocked. But there isn't a test pilot alive who'd quarrel with that on a machine like this. Columbia still not at a standstill. After this, one more test flight at the beginning of July, then Shuttle goes operational from November.
Okay, wheels are stopped, Houston.
Okay, Columbia, welcome home. That was a beautiful job.
Exchange there between Mission Control and the crew. And they'll aim eventually at a 14-day turnaround time for routine missions into space.
Unofficial wheel stop time, 8 days, 0 hours, 6 minutes, 10 seconds.
She came down on her 130th orbit, the longest flight so far, and just an hour ago, she was 150 miles up, travelling at 24 times the speed of sound.
Convoy 1, this is Columbia, how do you read?
It's been called the controlled descent of a brick. Some brick, $700 million a copy. And not yet on the scene, the massive amount of backup equipment, here they come, needed for a shuttle landing. Scores of personnel and trucks to make what's left of the fuel safe, and the gear they need to hoist Columbia onto the top of a jumbo jet to fly it back to base 1,500 miles away at the Cape. So, what used to be known as spam in the can, the days of the helpless astronaut strapped into a capsule on the top of a rocket, hurled into space and rudely dropped back by parachute, are well and truly gone. You've seen again the shape of space travel in the future, and you've seen it today, and it works. With that, back to Jim and Steve in the CBTV studio.
Thank you very much, Peter Sissons there. So that landed nice and safely, eh?
I think that was incredible, because they've never used that landing strip before, you know, and to come in like that with all the problems they've had. They've been up there sort of almost 24 hours longer than they should have been, and that's just amazing.
It's great stuff. Wow.
I must say, very sorry about cutting off Chaz and Dave short there, but their record is going up the charts very, very fast, isn't it?
In fact, it's at number 7 at the moment.
Good evening. The low-budget British film Chariots of Fire has won Hollywood's accolade as Best Film of the Year. It beat its glossier American rivals against the odds, picking up 4 Oscars in all. The delighted producer, David Putnam, said he was tongue-tied with excitement, but he recovered enough later to say he hoped the award would give the British courage to make their own films again. Colin Whelan won the Oscar for Best Screenplay, and the other awards were for the music and the costumes. The film tells the story of 2 British competitors in the 1924 Olympics, one a Jew and the other a Scot, facing the choice of athletic success or doing missionary work in China.
Jenny, I believe God made me for a purpose. But He also made me fast. And when I run, I feel His pleasure.
Chariots of Fire has been drawing the crowds in Britain and America. Colin Whelan put a finger on its success once he recovered his surprise at winning at all.
Well, if I'd believed all the American newspapers, we didn't have a cat in hell's chance. We weren't tipped on any of the American newspapers. I thought I had a reasonable chance of winning the screenplay. I thought that we were all pretty much the same standard. But I never dreamt that we'd win Best Picture.
Why do you think your film is so outstanding?
Well, I've a theory that it touches in all of us the spiritual core that we have, and it's usually only applied in films in a sentimental fashion, in the sort of Song of Bernadette or that sort of film. And when Liddell throws his head back in the final of the 400 meters and says, God made me for China, but He also made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure, and the music swells up, it touches something inside us, and everybody responds to it.
Touching the heartstrings is only half the problem. Getting the money to make British films like Chariots of Fire is much more difficult. With a budget limited to £3 million, it pales in comparison with the multi-million-dollar Hollywood epics. The film's success was welcomed by another British filmmaker, Sir Richard Attenborough.
I mean, I can tell you how excited I was. I switched on the 7 o'clock news this morning, and I literally danced around the breakfast table when I heard the news, because they're the outsider. They're against the huge, big-budget pictures, Reds and Raiders of the Lost Ark and On Golden Pond. It cost $6 million, which is a very small sum for a picture these days.
What will it mean to other British filmmakers?
Well, it will mean a great deal, because, as I'm sure you know, the major take, about 55–60% normally of a film, is in North America and Canada. And so the fact that a British film without any recognised British stars, with a totally indigenous subject matter, has actually broken through in America, will open the doors inevitably to a new audience, because the fact that they have not experienced British movies before, having enjoyed this one, another British movie follows, and of course that means a tremendous amount to the financiers in this country.
Despite the Hollywood competition, Chariots of Fire has awakened new interest in British filmmaking. Finance is still hard to come by, although the National Coal Board Pension Fund, for one, is investing in film productions, and others may now well follow suit. But until there's more British help forthcoming, films like Chariots of Fire will continue to take the accolades and those very necessary dollars.
And among some of the other Oscar winners, Sir John Gielgud as Best Supporting Actor in the film Arthur. It's his first Hollywood award in a film career spanning 58 years. And in A Night for the Over-70s, Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn won Oscars as Best Actor and Best Actress in On Golden Pond. The American Space Shuttle Columbia and its crew landed safely at White Sands, New Mexico a short time ago. It was the shuttle's third time in space, but the first time the astronauts have had to postpone a landing and stay in orbit an extra day. Yesterday, NASA called off the landing at White Sands because of high winds that whipped up a blinding sandstorm. Cape Canaveral, the launch site for Columbia 8 days ago, was put on standby as an alternative touchdown site. David Wilson watched the end to a successful but difficult mission.
Columbia survived re-entry and appeared dead on time 10 miles up in the sky. The weather down below at White Sands had been improving all day.
Turning right now into runway 17 at 20,000 feet. Airspeed 275.
The chase planes picked up the shuttle, dropping down towards the New Mexico mountains, dropping more than 10,000 feet a minute at this stage. Now Columbia's flared out into a shallow glide path. She's just a huge glider at this moment without engine power. She lands at just over 200 miles an hour. But something's wrong with the landing just here. Columbia appears to bob up again unexpectedly. NASA aren't sure why, and they're investigating. So the Space Shuttle system has survived its longest and most severe test yet. It's undoubtedly been a success, but a qualified success. And now the astronauts are coming out. The commander, Jack Lousmer, and the pilot, Gordon Fullerton. Undoubtedly they're tired men. They've had a lot of trouble to shoot on this trip. And Columbia has only one flight more before it's supposed to go into regular service.
Being greeted by George Abbey, the Director of Flight Operations at the Johnson Space Center.
The lavatory, the commander's stomach. And people said it was like a used car. Well, it's had 3 owners so far. A report from John Suchet.
Airspeed 280.
8 days, 4 million miles, 129 times around the Earth, and at this moment the Space Shuttle Columbia was over a little town in New Mexico called Truth or Consequences. Something the local people thought they wouldn't see when the scheduled landing yesterday was cancelled because of bad weather. But today the New Mexico sun shone and the people of Truth or Consequences watched the landing, and their hearts must have stopped, as did those of millions watching on television, as Columbia touched down and then seemed almost to try to take off again.
50 feet, gear coming. Here comes the gear. Gear down, 20. 10, 5, 4, touchdown. Nose gears, 10. Nose gears, 5, 4, 3, 3. Touchdown.
The immediate theories were either a gust of wind caught the nose, or Jack Lousmer was showing off his flying prowess and executing an aerodynamic brake, letting the wind stop the spaceship. Jack Lousmer and Gordon Fullerton have shown the scientists that Columbia can do everything expected of it, that it is truly a spaceship and a conventional plane. Its nose and tail can stand the heat of the sun and the iciness of space. It can stay in space longer than planned if it has to, and it can be brought down anywhere they choose. It has snags too. Tiles tend to drop off and minor things go wrong, like cameras not working. It also seems incapable of taking off on time, and bad weather causes it to be diverted, which makes it no different from any passenger jet. John Suchet, News at 10 at the NASA Monitoring Center.